The song is called Woman's World. The video opens with Katy Perry in a corset, surrounded by women in similar outfits, performing choreography in front of neon-lit backdrops designed to suggest empowerment. The lyrics declare that men are just living in a woman's world. The year is 2024. The response arrives in real time. Critics, fans, and the broader cultural conversation converge on the same observation simultaneously, and the observation is not about whether the message is right or wrong. It is about the gap between what the video claims and what the video is. That gap, the distance between the stated intention and the visible product, is the most instructive thing Katy Perry has produced in 10 years. Not because it is unusual, because it is in the most concentrated form available, the gap that has defined her career from the beginning. Understanding that gap requires going back much further than Woman's World. Here is the specific version of the question this story actually raises. Did Katy Perry destroy her own career? Or did a combination of her own choices and forces genuinely beyond her control dismantle a position that was, in retrospect, always more fragile than it appeared at its peak? The honest answer requires examining the full arc, the Pentecostal childhood in Santa Barbara, that the candy-colored pop persona was built partly against the 3 label rejections before the name Katy Perry existed, the specific commercial mechanics by which a struggling singer became the first solo artist since Michael Jackson to produce 5 #1 singles from a single album, and the cultural shifts of the mid-2010s that changed what the pop market rewarded. The honest answer is that both things are true. Some of what happened was her responsibility. Some of it was the predictable operation of forces that the pop industry applies to everyone who reaches the top of it. Understanding the difference is why this story matters. Here is what is actually at stake in examining this story carefully. The Katy Perry trajectory is not simply the story of a pop star who fell from grace. The entertainment industry produces that story every cycle, and it confirms what everyone already believes. This is the story of how the specific formula that produced one of the most commercially dominant pop careers of the streaming era's opening decade contains within itself the specific limitations that made the formula's eventual exhaustion structurally inevitable. Understanding that formula, what it was, where it came from, why it worked, and precisely when and why it stopped working is more useful than the cautionary tale version. The pop industry is not a meritocracy, and it is not a morality play. It is a system with specific mechanics. The mechanics are what this video is going to examine. Catherine Elizabeth Hudson was born on the 25th of October, 1984, in Santa Barbara, California, the middle child of Keith Hudson and Mary Perry Hudson, both of whom were Pentecostal pastors. The specific quality of the household she was born into, the specific intensity and specific constraints of a devoutly Pentecostal Christian family in 1980s and 1990s. America is the formation that every serious examination of her career returns to as the foundation of what she became and the specific source of the tension between the person she was formed to be and the person the pop industry converted her into. The household was strictly religious. Popular music was not permitted, or was permitted only in very limited forms. She was not allowed to use the word deviled in reference to eggs. Lucky Charms cereal was not permitted because it contained the word lucky, which was associated with the occult. The music she heard was so exclusively Christian that she did not know who Queen was until she was a teenager. The specific detail of these restrictions is instructive, not because it makes the household pathological. It was, by the accounts of the people who knew the family, a household of genuine love and genuine devotion, but because the specific quality of the cultural isolation it produced created in the person it formed a very particular relationship to secular popular culture. The relationship of someone who encountered it from the outside, who had to learn it rather than absorb it naturally, and who therefore came to it with a conscious appreciation of its specific pleasures that the people who grew up inside it could not quite replicate. Her parents took her to see Christian contemporary artist Stryper perform when she was 9 years old, and the specific impact of that concert, the lights, the performance, the specific quality of thousands of people responding together to a performer on a stage, is something she has described as the moment she understood at a level below intellectual comprehension what she wanted to do. She wanted to be on that stage. She wanted to produce that response. The specific religious framework in which the desire was first experienced, the worship concert, the communal surrender to the music, the performer as the conduit of something larger than themselves, is the framework that the secular pop career, in various and not always consciously acknowledged ways, reproduced in a different register. The pop concert as church, the single as communal experience, the parasocial relationship between pop star and fan as a version of the devotional relationship between believer and the object of devotion. She began studying music seriously in her early teens and was signed to a Christian music label, Red Hill Records, at the age of 15, recording and releasing a Christian pop album under her birth name, Katherine Hudson, in 2001. The album sold approximately 200 copies. The label folded, she was dropped. She was 16 years old and had already experienced the specific quality of institutional rejection that the music industry reserves for people who have not yet found the specific combination of commercial product and commercial timing that the industry requires. She moved to Los Angeles. She signed with Island Def Jam and then was dropped. She signed with Columbia Records and then was dropped. 3 label rejections before the age of 23. The labels that dropped her were not dropping her because she lacked talent. They were dropping her because the specific commercial product she was presenting did not, in their assessment, at the specific moment of their assessment, fit the specific hole in the market that the label's commercial strategy required filling. She was talented, but not yet specifically enough packaged. The packaging is what the Katy Perry persona, when it finally arrived, provided. The name change from Katherine Hudson to Katy Perry, Perry being her mother's maiden name, adopted because there was already a Kate Hudson in the entertainment world, was the first act of the construction of the persona that the subsequent commercial success was built on. The persona required a different name from the person, and the person and the team around her understood this before they understood what the rest of the persona would be. The name was the first indication that the commercial product being constructed was not simply Katherine Hudson with a record deal. It was Katy Perry, a figure who was related to Katherine Hudson but was not identical to her, who wore the specific combination of retro kitsch visual aesthetic and confessional emotional directness and strategic sexual provocation as a costume, and who deployed that costume with a specific intelligence and a specific intentionality that the people who subsequently dismissed her as a pure commercial product consistently underestimated. I Kissed a Girl was released in April 2008 and spent 7 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the song that converted Katy Perry from a struggling young artist who had been dropped by 3 labels into a commercially bankable property. The song was a commercial calculation, the specific calculation that the history of pop music had demonstrated repeatedly since at least the early 1980s. That a female pop artist kissing or simulating kissing another woman in a song or video was a reliable mechanism for generating the combination of male attention and female curiosity that commercial pop requires. The critical and political response was divided. The mainstream commercial response was enthusiastic. The response from LGBTQ+ critics and commentators was more complicated. The specific criticism that the song exploited the aesthetics of queer female desire for straight male titillation without the genuine identity investment that would make the exploitation something other than commercial calculation was made at the time of the song's release, and was a version of the criticism that would recur across her career whenever her cultural positioning produced a specific tension between the image she was projecting and the values she was claiming to represent. The tension between the image and the values is, as this analysis will argue, one of the structural features of her career present from the beginning, managed with varying degrees of skill across the years of dominance and progressively unmanageable as the career moved into its second decade. Teenage Dream, released in 2010, is the album that the commercial analysis of her career identifies as its peak achievement. The album produced 5 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100: California Girls, Teenage Dream, Firework, E.T., and Last Friday Night, a commercial achievement that made her only the second artist in history after Michael Jackson's Bad to send 5 singles from a single album to the top of the chart. The collaborators who produced it, primarily Dr. Luke, Max Martin, and Bonnie McKee, were among the most commercially accomplished pop production teams of that period. But the specific contribution she made to the collaboration, the melodic instincts, the lyrical specificity, the specific quality of her vocal performance that communicated genuine emotional investment rather than professional competence, is the dimension of the commercial success that the dismissal of her as a pure product of her collaborators most consistently underestimates. Firework is the specific song on Teenage Dream that the critical analysis of her peak identifies as the clearest single expression of what she was best at. The anthem of self-affirmation directed at people who feel like they do not belong, delivered with a sonic scale and a vocal performance that made the emotional statement feel earned rather than manufactured. The song was genuinely embraced by LGBTQ+ youth, by teenagers in the specific condition of not fitting in, that the song addressed by people whose relationship with the song was the relationship of recognition rather than simply the relationship of entertainment. The song worked because it was true, it was commercially calculated, and it was true. The two things coexisted in Teenage Dream with a frequency and a clarity that her subsequent albums did not always achieve. The Russell Brand marriage is the biographical event that the entertainment press covered most extensively during the peak years of her commercial dominance, and that the more careful examination of her career identifies as the event that most clearly revealed the specific personal and professional dynamics of her life at that moment. They married in October 2010 at the height of the Teenage Dream campaign. Brand filed for divorce in December 2011 by text message 14 months after the wedding. She was on tour in Australia when she received the text. She performed that evening and cried on the stage, and performed the next evening and kept going because the machinery of the tour required her to keep going. The specific image of Katy Perry performing California Girls and Teenage Dream and Firework to sold-out arenas while her 14-month marriage was ending by text message is an image that the more sympathetic accounts of her life and career return to, with a consistency of people who find in it the specific detail that humanizes the commercial phenomenon most effectively. She was, at that moment, simultaneously the most commercially successful pop artist on the planet, and a 27-year-old woman whose marriage had just ended in the most abrupt and impersonal manner available. The Taylor Swift situation is the dimension of the Katy Perry career that the entertainment press has covered more extensively than almost any other single element, and that the honest analysis requires examining with more care than the tabloid framing it has almost universally received. The feud began, in its public form, in approximately 2012 or 2013, when Swift released the song Bad Blood, widely interpreted as being about Perry, referencing a conflict involving backing dancers who had left Perry's tour to join Swift's. The specific asymmetry of the feud is the most instructive element of it for the analysis of Perry's career. Swift was, across the years of the public narrative, the party who appeared to be winning not in any direct competitive sense, but in the specific sense that the cultural positioning of the feud worked consistently to her advantage and consistently to Perry's disadvantage. Swift was the aggrieved party, the songwriter processing the conflict through her art, the person whose narrative of the situation was more emotionally legible and more sympathetically received. Perry was the counterpart whose public responses to the narrative were consistently less strategically sophisticated than Swift's management of it. The feud was resolved formally in 2018. The specific cultural damage to Perry's positioning, the cumulative effect of several years of being the less sympathetic party in a public narrative organized around the question of who was the villain, was not repaired. By the reconciliation, what happened next? The song that converted her from a struggling young artist into the most commercially bankable pop property of the subsequent 4 years arrived in 2008. And it arrived in a form that already contained the tension that would define everything that followed. Prism, released in October 2013, was the follow-up to The Peak. The album produced commercially successful singles Raw, Dark Horse, Birthday, and was, by the metrics of commercial pop, a successful album. It was not Teenage Dream. It did not produce the 5 number ones achievement. It produced hits that were technically accomplished and commercially effective, and that felt in ways that the Teenage Dream material did not, like the product of a formula being applied rather than a formula being discovered. The specific quality of the difference between Teenage Dream and Prism is the quality that the pop industry's internal analysts understand as the difference between an artist who has found their specific artistic identity and is expressing it, and an artist who is managing the commercial product of that identity. In Teenage Dream, the formula was fresh. In Prism, the formula was being maintained. The excitement of discovery is not always audible to the mass audience. It is audible in the long run, in the trajectory of the career's cultural relevance, in the degree to which the work continues to feel like news rather than product. The streaming economy is a structural change in the pop music industry that the analysis of any pop career of the 2010s and 2020s requires engaging with. The commercial model that produced Teenage Dream's 5 number ones achievement, the model in which chart performance was measured primarily by sales, in which radio airplay was the dominant distribution mechanism, was a model that the streaming transition was dismantling in real time across the same years that Perry was attempting to follow Teenage Dream with work of comparable commercial impact. The streaming economy changed the competitive landscape in ways that made the kind of dominant position Perry had occupied more difficult to sustain. More artists could reach more audiences more cheaply, which meant the market's attention was more fragmented. The algorithm replaced radio programmers as the primary gatekeeper. The parasocial relationship between artist and fan base became more intensive and more continuous, rewarding the artists whose engagement with their audiences was most direct and most frequent. Taylor Swift built the infrastructure for sustained relevance in the streaming economy across the same period. Perry's infrastructure was built for the pre-streaming economy. The infrastructure did not translate. The Dr. Luke situation is the dimension of the post-peak period that the critical analysis of her career cannot address fully without engaging with the specific legal and professional context that makes full engagement with it. Complicated. Dr. Luke Lukash Gottwald was the primary producer of her most commercially successful work, the collaborator whose specific sonic signature was the most clearly identifiable element of the Katy Perry sound from I Kissed a Girl through the Prism era. In 2014, his former artist Kesha filed a lawsuit against him alleging sexual assault and abuse across their professional relationship. The lawsuit was lengthy and contested. Perry continued working with Dr. Luke. The decision aligned her in the perception of the portion of her audience most invested in the feminist and progressive messaging that her public persona had been increasingly incorporating with the person against whom the allegations had been made. The alignment was not comfortable, and it was not strategically neutral. The cost was specific and measurable. The progressive leaning portion of her audience, the portion most activated by the firework era emotional utility, was the portion for whom this association was hardest to defend. She kept the association. The cost accumulated. The Katy Perry persona in its peak form, the cupcake bras, the candy-colored wigs, the specific retro kitsch visual aesthetic that the California Girls video most completely expressed was a construction that was simultaneously several things at once. It was a commercial calculation, the specific visual identity that distinguished her in a competitive pop marketplace. It was a genuine expression of specific aesthetic preferences. And it was at the level that the most careful analysis of the career requires acknowledging a protective structure, a way of being very visible and very famous while keeping the specific complexity of the actual person underneath the visibility managed and contained. The protective function of the persona is visible most clearly in its relationship to the formation. She grew up in a household that required a very specific performance of self, the performance of Pentecostal Christian identity, of devotion and propriety. The pop career required a very different performance, one organized around the kind of provocation and visual sexuality and thematic engagement with drinking and kissing girls. That was the precise opposite of the Pentecostal performance. Both performances were performances. The person giving them was, in both cases, producing a version of herself that served the context requirements rather than expressing an identity that existed prior to and independent of those requirements. The specific tension between the Pentecostal formation and the pop persona became publicly visible in 2012 and 2013 when Perry spoke with increasing directness about her relationship with her parents' faith and with the specific constraints the faith had placed on her childhood. She discussed the guilt, the confusion, the specific psychological impact of being told from early childhood that the desires she was experiencing for pop music, for boys, for the secular world outside the household were sinful. Her parents, who remained active Pentecostal ministers, responded in interviews in which they described her fame as the product of the devil's work. The specific quality of this public conflict, the pastor parents whose daughter was performing in cupcake bras and singing about kissing girls, was a conflict that the tabloid press found irresistibly entertaining, and that was underneath the entertainment a genuine family dynamic of real psychological weight. The maintenance of the relationship required a specific kind of psychological compartmentalization, the management of two incompatible accounts of who she was and who she was supposed to be, that the Witness era, with its impulse toward authenticity and transparency, was poorly equipped to sustain. Witness, released in June 2017, is the album that the critical and commercial post-mortems of her career most consistently identify as the single largest self-inflicted wound of the decline, the album in which the specific combination of creative miscalculation and strategic mispositioning and genuine artistic confusion was most fully expressed and most thoroughly documented. She described the album in the pre-release press as the sound of purposeful pop, of pop with a message, of a mature and politically engaged Katy Perry who had moved beyond the cotton candy aesthetic of the teenage dream era. The framing was both genuine and commercially catastrophic. The sonic direction, a move toward a cooler, more electronic, more restrained aesthetic, alienated the audience whose relationship with her had been organized around the maximalist pop production of her commercial peak without successfully attracting the audience that preferred the cooler register she was reaching for. Chained to the Rhythm, the lead single, was a song about mindless consumerism and social complacency that the music video communicated through the metaphor of a retro theme park. The distance between fireworks, empathy for the person who feels like they don't belong, and chained to the rhythm's performative political messaging is the distance between genuine emotional utility and something that looked like it from a distance but felt hollow up close. The audience noticed the distance. The charts recorded the noticing. The live stream. In the week of Witness's release, Perry conducted a 4-day, 96-hour continuous live stream from a house in Los Angeles in which she and various guests were filmed continuously in what the promotional concept described as a radical act of transparency and connection with her fan base. The live stream produced one of the most discussed moments in her public career, a conversation with a therapist conducted in front of the live stream cameras, in which she discussed her mental health with a directness and a specificity that produced a cultural conversation organized around questions of authenticity and vulnerability and the specific ethics of televised therapy rather than around the music. The live stream was not the cause of the album's underperformance. The album was going to underperform regardless because the music was not as good as her best work and the cultural positioning was not as accurate. But the live stream crystallized the specific problem of the witness era in a form that the critical conversation could engage with. The problem of an artist who was working very hard to show the audience who she really was and whose efforts to do so were producing not intimacy but a specific quality of uncomfortable overexposure, not authenticity, but something that looked like authenticity's anxious performance. The audience heard the difference. The audience always hears the difference. The specific moment in which the witness era marked the transition from commercial difficulty to genuine creative and commercial crisis is less the 96-hour live stream, whose failure was visible and documented, than the decision to associate the comeback with the vocabulary of political consciousness at a specific cultural moment when that vocabulary was being deployed by artists whose connection to the political experience it was expressing was direct. What followed revealed the full distance between what the Katy Perry persona could credibly claim and what the moment required. The Orlando Bloom relationship. She and the British actor began dating in 2016 and became engaged in February 2019, with a daughter, Daisy Dove Bloom, born in August 2020, is relevant to the career analysis in a specific way. The specific quality of what Perry's public persona communicated about her relationship with her own desires and her own life changed across the years of the Bloom relationship in ways that interacted with the witness failure and the post-witness identity question in directions that the commercial output of those years reflects. She became, in the public eye, a person in a stable relationship, engaged, then a mother. The specific identity that the Katy Perry commercial persona had been organized around the persona of the young woman living her best life, testing her own limits, having experiences, making mistakes she would turn into confessional pop anthems was an identity that the stable relationship and the motherhood complicated without replacing. The persona required a certain kind of instability. The life was becoming stable. The creative question of what Katy Perry sounded like from inside a stable life was a question that Smile, the 2020 album, answered with insufficient conviction. Smile, released in August 2020, was made in the aftermath of the witness failure and during the early months of the COVID-19 lockdown period, released on the day Perry's daughter was born. The album was positioned as a return to the upbeat, positive message pop that had been the most commercially successful dimension of her career. It underperformed. The lead single, also called Smile, was a pleasant, competently made pop song that communicated to the people who listened to it carefully the specific quality of optimism that is being performed rather than felt. 2020 was not a year in which uncomplicated optimism was the easiest product to sell, but more fundamentally, the audience could feel the difference between a firework where the optimism came from somewhere real and a smile where the optimism felt like a position that had been decided on in a creative meeting. The charts recorded the hearing. The period between Smile in 2020 and Woman's World in 2024 was a period in which Perry was mostly absent from the recorded music conversation and mostly present in the cultural conversation through events that were not organized around her music. The American Idol judging position, which she had held since 2018, became an increasingly contentious dimension of her public image, a position that her fans found endearing and that the portion of the pop and music industry press that covered the show found increasingly difficult to take seriously as a credible artistic judgment platform. The specific dynamics of the show reinforced the perception of a career that was operating in the legacy management phase rather than the active artistic relevance phase. The Blue Origin spaceflight in April 2025, Perry was one of 6 passengers on an 11-minute suborbital flight operated by Jeff Bezos' space company, generated a cultural conversation that was, in its specific character, perhaps the most instructive single document of where the public's relationship with her had arrived. The coverage was almost uniformly negative or negative adjacent, not savage, not contemptuous, but carrying the specific quality of the cultural conversation that surrounds a famous person whose judgment is being questioned with a kind of weary incredulity. She had kissed the ground after landing. She had wept. She had said that she felt she had experienced something profound. The response to these expressions of genuine feeling was mockery, the specific mockery that the internet applies to emotional expression from people who are perceived as insufficiently grounded, insufficiently connected to the specific cultural moment to have earned the emotional seriousness they are claiming. Woman's World, and what it communicated and failed to communicate, is the document that the period between Witness and the present most clearly produced. The song was made with Dr. Luke. The song was positioned as a feminist anthem. The song contained lyrics about women running the world, while the accompanying video presented Perry in the specific visual register of hypersexualization that the feminist messaging of the lyrics was in direct tension with. The critical consensus was that the song was confused at its core, that the specific combination of feminist message and male gaze visual presentation reflected a genuine confusion about what feminism means, rather than a deliberate subversive strategy. The more charitable reading is that the song was attempting to hold in tension 2 things that Perry's specific formation and career have always been in tension with each other: the Pentecostal background's specific relationship to female sexuality as either sinful or controlled, and a pop career's specific requirement that female sexuality be commodified and presented in ways that serve the commercial product. The tension had been present in the career from the beginning. In Woman's World, it was simply more visible than usual. The honest answer to the question, did Katy Perry destroy her own career, is a genuinely complicated yes and no. She contributed meaningfully to the commercial decline through specific choices that are identifiable. The Dr. Luke continued association and its specific cost with a progressive-leaning portion of her audience. The Witness creative and strategic miscalculations, the specific quality of the public persona management in the post-peak years that converted authentic emotional disclosure into overexposure. The Woman's World positioning confusion. These were choices. They had consequences. The consequences are visible in the commercial record. The honest answer also includes the forces that were not choices. The specific way that the pop industry's structural transition, the streaming economy, the fragmentation of audience attention operated on her career, regardless of what she did. Taylor Swift, the most commercially dominant pop artist of the same period, navigated that landscape with a specific combination of creative reinvention and fan cultivation and strategic positioning that produced sustained relevance. The comparison is instructive not to argue that Swift's success makes Perry's difficulties a personal failure, but to demonstrate that the landscape did not make sustained commercial relevance impossible for all artists. It made it harder. Some artists found ways through the difficulty. Perry, across the specific years of the difficulty, did not. The fan base, the Katy Cats, as they have identified themselves across the social media history of the career, is the dimension of the career's arc that the commercial analysis does not always adequately account for. The relationship between Perry and the most dedicated portion of her audience was, at its peak, one of the more intensely cultivated parasocial relationships in pop music of that era. A relationship built through the specific directness of her lyrical address, through the confessional quality of her best work, through the specific accessibility of the Katy Perry persona, as a figure of genuine warmth and genuine humor and genuine emotional openness. The fans who built their relationship with her on Teenage Dream and Firework are not wrong about what they receive from her. They receive something real. The question of what the subsequent years' output offered them in comparison to what the peak years offered is the question that the commercial record answers. And the answer is that it offered them less of the specific thing that had made the relationship meaningful, replaced with more of the specific thing that looked like that thing but felt to the people for whom the original thing had mattered, like its managed facsimile. Fan loyalty based on the peak rather than the present is a form of commercial credit. It is also a form of credit that draws down over time if it is not serviced. The most honest reading of the record is that both things are true. The rise was genuine. The formula was hers, and it worked, and it produced a level of commercial dominance that the people who dismiss her legacy have not reckoned with, honestly. The decline was real and was partly her responsibility and partly the responsibility of the industry and partly the responsibility of a cultural moment that was always going to pass. And the specific question of what comes next, whether the career finds its third act, whether the person underneath the persona finds the creative form that the third act requires, is the question that the record cannot answer yet, because the record is still being written. The specific moment in which the Witness era marked the transition from commercial difficulty to genuine creative and commercial crisis is less the 96-hour live stream, whose failure was visible and documented, than the decision to associate the comeback with the vocabulary of political consciousness at a specific cultural moment, when that vocabulary was being deployed by artists whose connection to the political experience it was expressing was direct and whose audiences had reason to receive the expression as genuine. The 2016 political moment and the specific cultural demand it created for artists whose politics were visible and consequential was a moment that rewarded a specific kind of authenticity that the Katy Perry persona organized around strategic provocation and ironic self-awareness rather than genuine political commitment was not designed to produce. She tried to produce it anyway. The gap between what the moment required and what the persona could credibly deliver was the gap that the Witness era fell into. It was not a gap between her politics and the market's politics. Her political positions were genuine. It was a gap between the character of the public persona and the character that the moment required, and no amount of strategic recalibration could close a gap of that specific kind at that specific speed. Subscribe if you didn't know this was the full story behind one of the most discussed collapses in pop history, because the tabloid version exists to entertain, and this channel examines what actually happened. And if this breakdown of how a formula built at the top of the pop industry stops working, and why the person inside it is often the last to see it change the way you look at fame, click the screen right now, because we have other videos featuring famous personalities and their dark secrets and stories that don't usually come to light. If you want to know more, click on our videos and subscribe.